Bueno, vamos a ir arrancando. Voy a hacer la introducción y la presentación en inglés, porque, bueno, nuestros invitados son de Brasil, así que para que se entienda toda la intro, la voy a hacer en inglés y arrancamos. Well, good morning. Let's make a brief introduction. My name is Mariano F. I am Executive Director at the Argentinian Fintech Chamber. This is the first Capacitación Fintech, or let's say Fintech talk we are doing this year. We're gonna have a many of this type of talks, a lot, let's say. The idea here is to address interesting topics with interesting people. In this case, we're going to talk about the recent crypto law, let's say, or virtual assets law in Brazil. And before starting, let me give a special thanks to Sebastián Logmeyer. He, a couple of weeks or maybe months ago, initially brought this idea. And well, thank you, Sebastián. He's partner at the Estudio Farrell here in Argentina. And he's part of the Argentina Fintech Chamber. And of course, a big thanks to our special guest from Brazil, Marcelo Padua Lima. He's partner at Cascione Advogados, which is a law firm in Sao Paulo. Just before starting, let me tell you that at the end of the talk, we're going to have a Q&A session. But if there's any question that is like super specific at the moment that Marcelo is talking, there's no problem. You can raise the hand or maybe even just ask with your voice, and he will be happy to answer. If there are no urgent questions, we can do it at the end, both written or via voice, as you wish. Sebastián, let me give you the mic. Thank you for this idea.
Well, thank you very much, Mariano. It's a pleasure for us to coordinate and organize this type of webinar. We think that it's quite important and relevant for the virtual asset business in Argentina. Please, let me introduce myself. My name is Sebastián Logmeyer, socio or partner at Estudio Farrell, Argentina. First of all, I want to say good morning for everybody, and I'm pleased to give some remarks related to the purpose of this webinar and introduce Marcelo Padua Lima. First of all, it is crucial for the business involved in virtual assets to have a sound legal and regulatory framework. In this regard, the virtual assets law passed recently by the Brazilian Congress is a key legal piece for the development of the business involved in virtual assets in one of the major economies of LATAM, and could be a precedent to be considered in other Latin American countries, especially in Argentina. After these brief remarks, please let me introduce Marcelo Padua Lima, who is a partner at Cascione Advogados in Sao Paulo office, specialized in banking and finance, payments, fintechs, and technology. He has a bachelor's in law by the University of Sao Paulo and an LLM by the University of Chicago, ranked in the categories banking and finance, regulatory and fintechs by chambers and partners, in the categories banking and finance, regulatory and legal opinions, technology and startups, and innovation by Leaders League, and the categories financial transaction bank, retail, and Sao Paulo by Análisis de Abogacía. Most voted rising star in banking and finance, regulatory and legal opinions by Leaders League in 2021. Marcelo, the floor is all yours. Please begin with your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be here with you. First of all, I would like to apologize for doing the presentation in English, but I'm not so fluent in Spanish, and I think in the end it would be detrimental to the presentation if we did it in Spanish, but apologies for that. And of course, if you have any questions and you want to ask the questions in Spanish, you can do it freely. I do understand, but I'm not so that fluent speaking, so that's why. But as Mariano and Sebastian were talking, we have been discussing this issue for the last few weeks, especially after the new Brazilian law on virtual assets was finally approved in Brazil in the end of 2022. It's an important topic in Brazil when we do imagine that it's going to impact other markets, or there's a potential of influencing new laws in different markets here in South America. And as we know that the crypto industry is very developed in Argentina and that many players in Argentina also operate in other markets, we think it's going to be interesting to discuss how things are going to be regulated here in Brazil and the potential impacts that you may face while doing business in Brazil, or even in the future if by any chance the Argentine government adopts a similar initiative, or other governments in Latin America also adopt similar initiatives. So as Mariano has commented, it's a presentation, but please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or if you want to raise issues during the presentation. But anyway, in the end, we're going to have a Q&A where you can discuss and you can present questions and you can discuss interesting aspects related to the presentation. So we have divided the presentation into 4 sections. So first is a very brief introduction. Then we're going to discuss the new law on virtual assets. That's the second chapter. Then moving to the Brazilian Securities Commission that has raised an opinion in the end of 2022 as well. And there's some interesting features or aspects of this opinion that we can discuss. And then finally, we're going to discuss what are the perspectives for the regulation of virtual assets. Because just one reminder, we have the new law, which sets forth the legal framework, but you still need the regulation, and the new law mentioned that there's going to be a regulation, but the regulation is not in place yet. So in the fourth part here, we're going to discuss the perspectives for the regulation. So as a part of our brief introduction, in a study carried out, Latin America represents almost 10% of the cryptocurrency market. Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico are the most relevant countries here in terms of volume of transactions. So it's, I would say, the fact that Brazil is adopting the law could be relevant here in the context of the region. In terms of market, Brazil is considered a relevant market for crypto transactions, as you know. Is the 7th main market for crypto. One interesting aspect here is that in Brazil, people usually see cryptocurrencies more as an investment than as a mean of exchange, like currency. So it's still, I'll say, a limited use of cryptocurrencies, although there's a lot of interest in the country for the investment of cryptocurrencies. I imagine that in view of the situation and different economic situations in Argentina and Brazil. In Argentina, you end up using more the cryptocurrencies as a means of exchange, since it's very flexible and it also has some advantages in terms of foreign exchange and so on. But in Brazil, it's still mainly an investment, not a currency. In terms of evolution here of the subject in Brazil, since 2014, there has been at least statements by local regulators regarding digital assets. So the first, I would say, relevant thing that happened in Brazil was in 2014. The central bank issued a statement on digital assets and mentioned that it was monitoring the evolution of the industry, pointed out some risks in connection with the investment in digital assets, mentioned that digital assets were different than traditional currencies or sovereign currencies. But it was only a statement and mentioned that the issue would still not be regulated. Then in 2014, there was a bill of law that intended to create a legal framework for digital assets. In 2017, a new statement by the Central Bank of Brazil that mentioned that it was still monitoring the market. There was some new facts or information in the statement. For instance, one that was relevant is that the Central Bank mentioned that whenever you did transactions using cryptocurrencies, you'd have to also comply with the foreign exchange controls and regulations. And I know that this is something that you can relate in Argentina, because in Brazil we also have strict foreign exchange controls. It's reminiscent from the 70s, 80s, or even before. Now the foreign exchange law has finally been amended, and there are some major changes. We have a new legal framework that was approved by the Congress in 2021 and then entered into force in the end of last year. So we have a bit more flexibility now, but I'll say that we still have a very controlled foreign exchange market. And the fact that the central bank mentioned that transactions with digital assets would have to comply with the foreign exchange controls was a relevant information at the time, and it's still an issue, I'd say, even now. We also had some statements.
Eu estou fazendo a contagem desse mês agora de janeiro para a gente.
I think someone is with the microphone on. Please turn on. And then in 2019, we had an important also instruction by the federal revenue authorities. One fact is that even before digital assets were subject to a specific law, the tax authorities in Brazil were already concerned about investments in digital assets and earnings that you can receive in these types of investments. And there were instructions on how to tax any specific income or earnings that you receive in transactions with digital assets. Finally, 2021, we have the Bill of Law that was turned into the actual digital or virtual assets law that was approved at the end of last year. One additional comment, also in the end of 2022, last year, we had an opinion by the Brazilian Securities Commission that consolidates all prior opinions and also innovates and brings some additional information on how security tokens or any digital asset that has the feature of a security should be treated in Brazil. So this is just a general introduction and framework, and now we're going to focus on the virtual assets law itself. So I would say it's if you read the law, it's a very short law, very few articles. It's basically a general legal framework. Doesn't go into any details, or it's just like the main definition of what is virtual asset. And even though the focus of the law is on the virtual asset service providers, not on the virtual asset itself, you have to define virtual asset in order to define who is a virtual asset service provider. So there's a brief definition of virtual asset in the law, also a definition of virtual asset service provider, and then we have some authorization requirements, and this is something important to bear in mind, that it's going to be necessary to have an authorization in order to be able to provide the services in Brazil, which is similar to what we have here in the country for financial services and most payment services. We also have rules governing the transition for the entities that are already operating here in Brazil. We have some certain powers that are granted to a specific local regulator to regulate the sector. And there is also an important information that enables the accumulation of activities of services with virtual assets by institutions that are authorized by the Central Bank of Brazil, for instance, financial institutions or payments. We are going to go now in more detail in all of these aspects here. They are the key aspects of the law. One special thing to note is that, as we mentioned, the focus of the law is on the service providers, not on the assets, which is something that makes sense, considering that it's very complicated to regulate assets that are international, that are decentralized, and then the focus is on the provision of the services, not on the assets themselves. Another important thing to note is that the law clearly is not applicable to assets representing securities. So if you go to the first article of the law, there is a specific provision saying that the law is not applicable to security tokens or any digital assets representing securities, and that the Brazilian Securities Commission, called CVM, will retain its authority to regulate any type of security, including digital assets that have digital securities. So this is also important to bear in mind, especially because we have seen in other jurisdictions securities commissions get involved in an increasing way in transactions involving digital assets. So this still may be a factor in Brazil. We have to see to what extent the Brazilian Securities Commission will limit their scope and their activity, or if they're going to wish to increase their activity in the sector. It's something that's still unclear. But the fact is that CVM, Securities Commission in Brazil, retains their authority to regulate securities in general. Another important thing to note is the effective date. The law went into force after 180 days from its publication date, so it will be on June 20 of this year. So there's still some time to adapt. And even after the law is also enacted, players and operations are going to have a chance also to adapt. This is something that we're going to discuss in the following slides. So then we go to the definition of virtual asset for the purpose of the law. And virtual assets were defined as follows. So it's a digital representation of value that can be traded or transferred electronically and used for payments or for investment. Two purposes here. And then there are some exclusions here, some carve-outs, and the exclusions are, for instance, national currency. So Brazilian reais are not digital assets for the purpose of law. Same applies to foreign currencies, pesos, dollars, euros, and so on are not digital assets. Electronic currency, and when you say electronic currency in Brazil, it's basically the representation of Brazilian reais that were included in a digital asset, in a payment account or a digital asset, digital portfolio. But it's Brazilian reais, so electronic currency are Brazilian reais as well. Another thing that it's, even though the wording is a bit confusing, but points and loyalty program rewards are not viewed as digital assets or virtual assets as well. And the same applies to securities, financial assets, and so on. So there's at least here's some clear definitions, but of course, by applying the law in the future, of course, there's going to be challenges. For instance, discussions on whether NFTs would be included or not. And as we have new virtual assets being created in the market with different features, we are going to have certainly discussions on when to apply the law or not. Another important thing to note is that the law also mentions that the local regulator will be able to define the assets, of course, based on these legal guidelines. But there will be some level of discretion to the local regulator to determine when a certain asset will be viewed as a virtual asset for the purpose of the law. And as we mentioned, security tokens would be outside of this. Then, after we define virtual assets, which are key to define then the virtual asset service provider, then we have the definition of virtual asset service provider. And these are basically legal entities that perform at least one of the following activities, but doing these on behalf of third parties. So the exchange of virtual assets for basically acquiring virtual assets using national currency or foreign currency, exchanging one virtual asset for another virtual asset, transferring virtual assets, providing custody or administration of virtual asset services. And then there's a final situation here, which, to be honest, the wording is also not that clear, that mentions participation in financial services, offering by an issuer or sale of virtual assets, or related to the offering by an issuer or sale of virtual assets. For us, it's that the wording of this specific type of service is not that clear, but the other ones are quite evident. So basically, for facilitating the purchase of virtual assets using currency, the exchange of virtual assets, transfer or custody, administration, then will be providing the services related. And it suffices to provide one of the services to be included in the definition. And if you are including the definition, then it will be subject to the legal framework and then the regulation, including authorization requirements. And then the second, I'll say, after we define what is a virtual asset for the purpose of the law and what are the services that are provided by virtual asset providers, then there are the authorization requirements. And in this context, the law mentions the need of a prior authorization by the regulator. So it's then, in this sense, it's really similar to what we have in terms of financial services in Brazil. There is also, there's going to be a specific act by the executive branch in Brazil that's going to appoint a regulator to regulate the sector. Could be one or more regulators, but I'll say that it's likely going to be the central bank. That's everything points out to be in the central bank of Brazil, the local regulator to be in charge. With this specific, I would say, with this minor, I would say, comment that the Brazilian Securities Commission will retain, at least in part, jurisdiction to supervise certain digital assets when there are features of securities. There are also transition rules. So, for instance, if you have an entity in Brazil that is already providing services involving virtual assets, you're going to have specific time to adapt, so that you have the 180 days that this is general for the law to 2024. So we have this time, and there is also going to be a specific additional time for adaptation, and this time is going to be not less than 6 months, and is going to be determined by the regulator once the regulator is appointed in Brazil. In terms of powers, the Brazilian regulator are going to have some very broad powers to supervise the industry. So, for instance, the powers include the power to authorize the operation, so the authorization itself. And there's also need to obtain authorizations for the transfer of control, mergers, spin-off, incorporation. So all the main corporate reorganizations that you can do involving a virtual asset service provider are going to be subject to authorization by the local regulator, which, by the way, is what happens in Brazil already. If you have a payment institution or a financial institution, it's basically the same type of power that is going to the central bank of Brazil in connection with these operations. And the main concern here, of course, is one, to have an authorized entity, first of all. And then afterwards, if you have any major change in the operation of the entity, and if you have, for instance, new investors, a change of the controlling shareholder, this is also something relevant. And then it has to be submitted to the regulator that must evaluate it and authorize if it deems convenient. The same applies for the appointment of officers to key positions in the virtual asset service providers. They have to be authorized by the Central Bank of Brazil, or in this case by the regulator, which we assume is the Central Bank. And it's also the same that happens with payment institutions and financial institutions. In addition, the regulator will have the powers to supervise the virtual asset service providers and also apply sanctions. And there's a express reference to this law, Law 13506, which is the law that governs the administrative proceedings involving the Central Bank of Brazil and also the Brazilian Securities Commission whenever there's any breach of the financial or securities laws. There's also the power to cancel authorizations. So, for instance, if the service provider fails to comply with certain obligations, the Brazilian regulator may be able to cancel authorization. And finally, also the ability to regulate the interface between transactions with virtual assets and also the foreign exchange and foreign investment regulations. And by granting this power, for us, it's even more clear that's going to be the Central Bank of Brazil, which is the regulator that already regulates foreign exchange market and also foreign investments. And of course, there's a very important connection between transactions with virtual assets and the foreign exchange market, because in many cases you have cross-border transactions involved in virtual assets, and it's not that easy to have a uniform and consistent application of the foreign exchange controls with transactions involving virtual assets. So this is going to be something, in our opinion, still a little bit challenging to be implemented, but it's an important factor as well. And there's also something interesting that is mentioned in the law, is that authorized institutions by the Central Bank of Brazil, and by authorized institutions, we imagine financial institutions and also payment institutions. will be, in theory, able to provide services involving virtual assets, exclusively or combining with other activities, provided it should be still subject to regulation. But at least our impression here is that the law will enable the more traditional financial institutions and institutions to also operate in the virtual assets market without the need to open a specific virtual asset service provider to provide services. So this is also interesting, and it remains to be seen how it's going to be regulated here in Brazil in the next months. In addition, there are also some important provisions related to compliance, criminal law, and also consumer protection. So there is also now the KYC AML law in Brazil that is focused on preventing money laundering has been amended, and has been amended to include expressly in the list of entities that are obliged to comply with KYC and AML obligations the virtual asset service providers. In the past, there were some controversies as to what extent the law would be applicable. Most players were applying law and were complying with the KYC and AML law, but now it's 100% clear that the law is applicable and that you have to comply. In addition, there are specific increased sanctions for money laundering crimes involving the use of virtual assets, and this is because there's I would say a concern with local authorities regarding the potential use of virtual assets for illicit activities, and this is why they are also increasing the sanctions for crimes involving virtual assets. There is also a new type of crime that was included in Brazilian criminal code, which involves frauds using virtual assets. We had some incidents in Brazil in the past where there were like Ponzi schemes or pyramid schemes involving virtual assets. So there's a concern about the use of virtual assets, or at least the advertisement of the use of virtual assets for illicit activities and Ponzi schemes. So there's also now a new type of crime. One thing that is interesting, there's also a change. The law introduces the change in the financial crimes law, which is a law that is focused mainly on activities carried out in the financial system and the securities market, to say that the virtual asset service providers now will be treated as an equivalent to financial institutions, and then the law will apply to them. This is interesting because this is a law specialized in the financial market. There are some very strict sanctions to crimes affecting the financial market and the capital market. And by doing this, you are also subjecting the providers of virtual asset services to new specific crimes that wouldn't be applicable if this change was not implemented. One thing that is also interesting is that when we had the payments law in Brazil in 2013, and then the regulation also in the same year, there wasn't a specific provision like that. So, for instance, if you're operating a payment institution, you won't be subject to the law. But if you're operating a virtual asset service provider, you will be subject. This is interesting. And honestly, I don't know why the different treatment, but I would say that in this case, the concerns about the use of virtual assets for illicit activities was probably the reason why the specific provision was. And there is also something interesting here is that there's a specific provision in the law mandating the subsidiary application of the Brazilian consumer protection laws, transactions involving the services involved in virtual assets. This is something that could be already implied. We actually didn't need that provision to apply the consumer protection code in certain situations, but with this provision, it further reduces the risk of, or at least the room for virtual asset service providers to argue that they are not subject to consumer protection laws in their relationship with clients. There were also some provisions that were being discussed in the Congress that were not approved. I would say one of these provisions is particularly important, which is that there was a provision in the Bill of Law stating that the assets held by virtual asset service providers on behalf of their clients would constitute a separated state and would not commingle with the assets of the virtual asset service provider. The idea here was to protect the assets that were held by the service providers on behalf of their clients, and thus protecting the clients against any issues involving the virtual asset service providers. But this provision was not approved, did not pass in the Congress, so the law was enacted without this provision. One thing to bear in mind is that we have a similar provision. We have similar provisions in different laws in Brazil, and one of these laws is the payments law, enacted, published in 2013, that protects e-money. So we do have a protection granted by law to e-money and also to the payment flows until the payment reaches the payee. But we do not have a similar feature in the virtual assets law. One thing to comment here as a context, the law was being discussed, actively being discussed during 2022. There was an expectation that the law was going to be approved before the presidential elections that happened in October last year. But the law wasn't approved, discussions jammed or stopped, were interrupted. And then the elections came, and to be honest, our expectation was that the law was going to take more to be enacted because we had a new president, a new Congress, and so on. But what we think that happened is that due to the problems involving FTX, the law was suddenly expedited. The approval of the law was expedited in the end of last year, and it was approved right before Christmas. But we think that it is directly related to what happened outside in the FTX debacle. Anyway, the fact is that this provision that governed the segregation of assets was excluded from the law and did not pass, and it remains to be seen if this was a smart decision or if it's going to add risks to the industry. There was also a specific provision, was a tax benefit that was excluded from the law, was a zero rate of federal taxes from the purchase of equipment software for mining virtual assets, but this was not approved as well. I'll say two other issues, I'll say main pending legal and regulatory definitions. One of them is whether you're going to apply to digital or to virtual asset service providers the typical insolvency regimes that apply to financial institutions and payment institutions. This is something that, in my opinion, should be included in the law. It wasn't included in the law, and if you don't have a provision, a legal provision saying that you apply these specific regimes to insolvency situations affecting virtual assets providers, then what would likely happen is that you're going to have a typical bankruptcy regime or organization regime without the specific provisions of these insolvency regimes that apply to financial institutions, which in general enable the Central Bank of Brazil to appoint managers to the institution and to have to actually step in the managing of the institution that is facing an insolvency crisis or other types of problems. So we do not have this provision. So at least until we have a provision like that, bankruptcy will be the typical bankruptcy applicable to all enterprises in Brazil. We also have, one thing that is not clear is to what extent we're going to apply the bank secrecy provisions, bank secrecy law, to transactions involving virtual assets. This law, we have a specific law from 2001, and the law lists a number of institutions that are obliged to comply with bank secrecy obligations. And there is one of the options is that entities appointed by the National Monetary Council. So if, and assuming that the central bank will be appointed as a regulator, it remains to be seen if the National Monetary Council is going to include virtual asset service providers in this as entities obliged to comply with the bank secrecy law. And just as a minor comment here with regard to the bank secrecy law, as you see, it's an old law, has more than 20 years. It's focused, I'll say it's broader in a way than the Brazilian data protection law because it applies to clients in general. So you have to observe bank secrecy in transactions of your clients. And by clients, you mean individuals, but also legal entities, which is different from the data protection law in Brazil, for instance. And it's when you are dealing or you're processing information protected by bank secrecy for clients, and you're doing this, for instance, for business purposes, and you're sharing with third parties, you have to obtain consent, which is narrower, let's say, than if you go to the Brazilian data protection law, which enables you to process law based on different reasons, not only consent. So there are some issues here to be discussed in the future, especially if the bank secrecy law becomes applicable to virtual asset service providers as well. And with this, we ended our analysis of the law. As we have mentioned, the law is broad. It's really broad. It's a broad legal framework, and there are some key features that we have discussed. And after that, I think the main things that are going to happen is the Brazilian executive branch is going to appoint a regulator, likely going to be the Central Bank of Brazil, and then it will start the work of enacting or discussing regulations for the sector. And we expect that these regulations are going to be really detailed, but this is something that we can discuss in the final chapter here of our presentation. Now, shifting to the Brazilian Securities Commission and Federal Revenue Office. In terms of the Brazilian Securities Commission, the main concern so far has been focused on virtual assets that have the features of securities, especially if you're talking about ICOs and virtual assets being issued for the purposes of getting funding for enterprises. I think this was, by at least until now, the main concern by the Brazilian Securities Commission. This CVM opinion, it consolidates prior opinions by the Brazilian Securities Commission and also innovates in some aspects. In terms of definitions, there's a definition of digital asset for the purposes of this opinion. So basically, the opinion says digital assets are digitally represented assets protected by cryptography that can be subject to transactions, executed and stored through distributed ledger technology. So this is just a general definition of digital assets. And then the Brazilian Securities Commission talks about types of digital assets. So first they mentioned payment tokens and cryptocurrency would fall in this definition. Then they mentioned utility tokens that grant you access to products and services which are not of interest by the Brazilian Securities Commission. And then finally they mentioned the asset-backed tokens, which can represent tangible or intangible assets and include, for instance, security tokens. And security tokens are, of course, a concern of the Brazilian Securities Commission. And the opinion mentions, of course, that security tokens can be viewed as securities. Of course, it depends on the economic essence of the tokens and what functions it serves. Then the Brazilian Securities Commission mentions three situations in which you can have a security, and then the Securities Commission would be authorized to supervise the market. So first of all, I'll say probably the most evident one is the collective investment contract. This is something that is akin to the Howey test that you have in the US, whereby you have a type of a catch-all that you can use to include different assets that have the features of securities but are not typical securities like shares, for instance, commercial papers, and so on. And by the definition of collective investment contract, which was included in Brazil in the early 2000s, is a contract or title that can generate participation, partnership, or compensation rights, including from the results of the provision of services, and which income comes from the effort from the entrepreneurial third party. So with this broad definition, if you have something that has these features, for instance, a token or a digital asset issued by a company, then you'll be dealing with the security, and this will trigger, of course, a number of obligations with the Brazilian Securities Commission. And of course, if you do this, if you offer a collective investment contract in the form of a digital asset, and you do not comply with the laws and regulations, you'll be subject to sanctions in Brazil. In addition, of course, if you have any type of digital representation of a security, like a certificate, for instance, a depository receipt or something like that, this would also be viewed as a security, even if it's a digital asset. And finally, this is something interesting, derivatives. So for purposes of the Brazilian law, derivatives are viewed as securities. There's a very broad definition of derivatives in the law, and they are encompassed by the supervision by the CVM, the Securities Commission. And of course, you can have in many circumstances derivatives that have as underlying assets digital assets, and in these cases, they are also subject to supervision by the Brazilian Securities Commission. Of course, if you have, for instance, a security token that is a collective investment contract, you have to comply with the regulations by the Brazilian Securities Commission, CVM, which include, for instance, the prior registration of the security with the Brazilian Securities Commission. If you are providing any type of qualified services involving the assets that are securities, this also triggers an obligation to have a specific license with the Brazilian Securities Commission and also comply with the regulations of the Securities Commission. So this includes the centralized deposit of the assets, clearing, settlement services, bookkeeping, issuing certificates, and so on. These are all activities that are regulated by the Brazilian Securities Commission, and if you're dealing with a security token, you'll be subject to, you have to comply with these obligations as well. Another thing that was mentioned by this opinion by the Brazilian Securities Commission is the need to have a full and adequate disclosure of any offerings of digital assets that have the features of securities. So this applies to the rights of the token holders. So you have to identify who is the issuer, assuming that you have an issuer, the activities that are done by the issuer, rights of the holders, including political and economical rights, expected economic returns, if there are any fees and charges, and so on. And you also have to provide disclosure of information regarding trading, infrastructure, ownership of tokens. Just as an example, you have to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of DLT technologies. You have to talk about token ownership management, protocol, governance rules, identification of holders, and so on. The opinion lists a number of things that have to be disclosed with a certain level of detail. So if you are doing an ICO or something like that, and the security, you are issuing security tokens, you have to comply with these requirements. Of course, if you are dealing with a decentralized asset, then this could be really challenging, and it's still not clear how the Brazilian Securities Commission is going to deal with situations like that. I'd say it's easier if you have a clear issuer and a doing ICO, but in other circumstances, this could be challenging. In addition, I think something interesting that is mentioned here in the opinion is that investment funds in Brazil would continue to have limitations in terms of investments in digital assets. So far, what has been enabled to the investment funds in Brazil is to invest indirectly in virtual assets, mainly by investing in vehicles overseas that in turn invest in digital assets. This is how it's going to be working. It's how it's working. But we do have also changes in terms of regulation of investment funds. And in this regard, we do have a new regulation here issued by the Brazilian Securities Commission, which is Resolution 175 from last year as well. And the interesting thing here is that this new regulation enables investment funds to invest directly in digital assets. This is a huge change, I'll say, in the market. The regulation is still not enforced, will be enforced in April 3rd of this year. But there are some requirements that have to be complied if you are an investment fund investing in digital assets in Brazil. And it still remains to be seen how complex is going to be compliance with this requirement. So, but I think in general, good news is that investment funds in Brazil will be able to invest in digital assets in the near future. There's also an interesting move in terms of self-regulation. We have an important self-regulatory entity in Brazil called Anbima that is focused on the investment funds industry, and they have proposed a public hearing on specific requirements applicable to investment funds that invest in digital assets. The main focus here is disclosure and the regulation details a number of risk factors that are applicable to the investment in digital assets, and that should be disclosed in the bylaws of the fund and in marketing material in order to inform potential investors on the risks of investing in digital assets. And finally, here, there is also specific provisions, as we have mentioned before, by the tax authorities in Brazil. And basically, if you are earning income from transactions associated with digital assets, or if you hold digital assets, you have a number of requirements in terms of compliance of the regulation here in Brazil. So we have disclosure requirements, and we also have to collect taxes in connection with these transactions. And with this, we have finished the part of the Securities Commission and tax authorities, and we move to the final part of the presentation, when I discuss a little bit about the new regulation that's going to be enacted for the virtual assets law. So after the law was published, there were a number of news published by Brazilian newspapers and the media in general on next moves in terms of regulation. It seems that the Brazilian Securities Commission is not going to be involved in the regulation of virtual assets, unless, of course, they have the features of securities. And there are, for instance, news published here mentioning that crypto would be outside of the regulatory agenda of the Brazilian Securities Commission for 2023. So it all points out the Central Bank of Brazil as being the main regulator. I would say that, assuming that it's going to be the central bank, which is the most likely scenario, there were some news here stating that the central bank would like to impose the segregation of assets in the regulation of digital assets. We were discussing the issue of segregation in the context of the law, and in the context of the law, it wasn't approved, which is problematic in our opinion, because if you have a segregation imposed by law, you have a much greater protection against third-party creditors of digital asset service providers. But if you do not have this provision in law, what the Central Bank of Brazil could do is for instance, an obligation to hold assets in a specific account or linked to specific or a specific custodian, things like that. But that wouldn't give you the protection you probably need against third-party creditors, for instance, in case of any insolvency situation affecting the digital asset service provider. If you, in a parallel with the payments industry, for instance, in the payments industry, we do have a provision in the law that protects protects e-money and funds in connection with payment transactions from third-party creditors. And we also have provisions issued by the Central Bank of Brazil in the regulation stating, for instance, that e-money issuers must keep the funds in an account with the central bank or invested in federal bonds. For instance, you cannot invest these funds in other assets. You cannot invest in virtual assets. You cannot invest in investment funds and things like that. You can only keep the funds in the central bank or do very conservative investments. So if you go to the payments industry, you have a double degree of protection. You have the protection granted by law, and you also have provisions stating that the institutions have to segregate these funds and protect these funds. If you move to the virtual assets industry, you do not have the protection granted by law because this was not approved in the law. So if you have something, there will be something mandated by the Central Bank of Brazil in the regulation, and it's probably going to be something like keep the funds deposited in a specific depository or something like that, which is going to be less effective, of course, than we have in the payments industry. There is also a reference to strict obligations in terms of KYC and AML provisions. And when I talk about KYC AML in Brazil, we do have the KYC AML law that we have mentioned before, and then we have specific regulations depending on the sector. And if you go to for instance, into the financial sector, we have specific regulations enacted by the Central Bank of Brazil that further detail and impose additional obligations on how to comply with KYC, AML, and CFT obligations. So we expect that if the central bank is actually appointed as the regulator, the existing regulation on KYC ML will be expanded to include virtual asset service providers and may be amended to impose additional obligation that will be specific for the industry and maybe in a different chapter or different provisions that could be establish further obligations in connection with KYC and ML. When you talk about regulation by the Central Bank of Brazil, I think another key aspect to take in mind, take into consideration, is that at least in the past, I'd say 2 or 4 years, the central bank has been using more frequently public hearings to discuss new regulations. So any relevant proposals of new regulations by the Central Bank of Brazil have been preceded by public hearings, whereby the Central Bank of Brazil opens a specific space for market participants to comment on the proposed regulation, to suggest changes and amendments and improvements to the regulation. And especially if you talk about a relevant regulation like the one applicable to virtual assets, we expect something similar to be done in Brazil. Also, making a reference to what happens in the payments industry, which was more recently regulated. What we have seen in the payments industry is that the central bank started with a specific framework in terms of regulation, which was proposed in a moment that central bank still had, let's say, less knowledge of the details of the industry. And then once the central bank got more contact with the industry and was closer to the actual operations and participants, it ended up changing a number of key aspects of the regulation. So in the years that happened after the regulation was enacted, there were several changes in the regulation until the Central Bank of Brazil managed to get a more efficient and adequate regulation for the sector. We expect something similar here in terms of digital assets or virtual assets. Probably the Central Bank of Brazil, they already studied the issue, of course. They have people there that are aware of how the industry operates. But of course, once they start to regulate it, there may be some issues, something that need to be improved. And we do expect some changes. Probably you are going to have 2 or 3 years at least of subsequent changes in the regulation until it gets like a more of a final look on how it's going to work. And we also expect, especially if it's the Central Bank of Brazil, that the regulation is going to be similar in some aspects to the regulation already existing to financial institutions and also payment institutions. If you see, for instance, the authority that was granted to Central Bank to the regulator in Brazil, it's similar to the authority that was granted in the past to the Central Bank of Brazil with regard to the regulation of the payments industry, and even in the 60s, the regulation of the financial system. And the Central Bank is used to regulate specific entities in the sectors. And we expect that this is going to also to be used as an inspiration for the regulation of the virtual asset service providers industry. So there are probably going to be several points in common in the regulation of financial institutions, payment institutions, and also virtual asset service providers. And this is something that we expect in the near future. And with this, we have finished our presentation, and we can open the room here for discussion and for the Q&A. If you have any questions, it will be a pleasure to discuss. Comments, questions, we are available to discuss with you. And we do have some like 30 minutes to do that, so please feel free to comment.
Marcelo, thank you for your presentation. It was really clear. Let me ask one specific question, which is strictly related to the job we do as an association, as a chamber. You said the Banco Central do Brasil has some type of public hearings or something like that in order to generate some, let's say, public sector and private sector interaction. I would like to know, like, how are they working correctly? Like, is it like a real space where the private sector and the public sector are interacting, or is it like more like a, let's say, formal space with no actual activity? How is it? Just like for us to understand how is it working?
I would say that once the proposed regulation is presented, of course, the central bank has already done a lot of work before proposing the regulation. So it's certainly inclined to approve the regulation as proposed. But we have seen situations, several situations in the past where market participants have proposed certain amendments, in some cases even relevant amendments to the regulation, and the central bank did pay attention to the suggestions and amended the regulation. So I would say definitely it worth your time and attention to comment on this in the public hearing, if and when it's presented, because we have seen situations, more than one situation, when the bank has changed the direction of the regulation in view of comments by the market, by market participants. So it makes sense to participate if you're interested.
Okay, so it's extremely valuable.
Yeah,
those spaces are like extremely valuable.
Definitely,
thank you,
yes.
Marcelo. Is there any other question?
Yeah, Marcelo, I have one. How would the new law would regulate external agents like crypto agencies that doesn't have any entity in Brazil? How would like regulate and protect the consumer and investments and the assets?
So if you do a parallel between what happens in the financial industry and the payments industry, for instance, I would say that with the new law, and the new law is stated that you have to in order to be able to provide the services in Brazil, you must be authorized by the central bank or by the regulator to provide the services. So you need a prior license. There are probably, in case of foreign players, they wouldn't be able to provide the services in Brazil. Of course, when it comes to virtual assets, since everything is online, it's much harder to set the boundaries on what is being provided in Brazil and outside. But we do already have these types of issues if it comes, for instance, to financial services and payment services or even security services. So my impression is the following. You're not going to be able to provide services in Brazil. And if you do that in Brazil, not having a legal entity in Brazil and not being authorized, you'll be facing sanctions by the Central Bank of Brazil or the regulator. But of course, you can provide services overseas as long as you're not advertising this to Brazilians, and if you comply with the foreign exchange regulation. So, for instance, a Brazilian can have investments overseas and can, for instance, remit funds to a different country, and then once the funds are overseas, it can do investments, for instance, in the US or in Europe or China or whatever. This is something that is permitted. But of course, if you have a foreign entity providing the services to Brazilians, offering the services to Brazilians, directly to Brazilians, and it's not licensed in Brazil, then there's a risk of sanctions by the local regulator.
Okay, thanks. Just adding one more question. It wasn't very clear to me. You start the presentation saying that Brazilians today see crypto as an investment, right? More than something like payments or other financial services. But also there is a limitation on making investments, like you just said, in crypto, right? That you could do with an abroad agency, or am I wrong? Sorry.
Sorry, by limitation, what do you mean?
I don't know. I just understood that there's some limitation for Brazilians right now to invest with crypto agencies or some other entity that make investments through digital assets.
The issue there's a limitation in terms of investment funds. So investment funds in Brazil cannot invest directly in virtual assets. The only way they can have exposure to virtual assets is if they make an investment overseas in a foreign vehicle, which in turn invests in virtual assets, and then that's the type of exposure that you can have. But one thing to bear in mind is that the regulation by the Brazilian Securities Commission has changed. It's not in force yet, but has changed. And now, once the new regulation is in force, you will be able to invest in investment funds in Brazil, which in turn invest in virtual assets in Brazil as well. So it won't be necessary anymore for the funds to invest in vehicles overseas to have exposure to these assets. I think this is the change. But Brazilians are themselves, they can purchase virtual assets.
Andre, can you please mute yourself because there's an echo? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Andre, was it clear now or not?
Yeah, Marcelo, thank you very much. That was it.
And I say it's a positive change because now you have also the foreign the investment regulation, investment funds regulation, enabling investment. So I think this could be something that will also increase investments in virtual assets in Brazil. Now that you can have the investment funds investing here in the country in this asset.
Thank you, Andre and Marcelo. There's another. I can see another hand. Juan Pablo. Do you want to ask?
Yeah. Hi, Marcelo. Thank you for that valuable time. My question is, can virtual assets provider act as crypto as a service agents for banks or any other financial institution? Thank you.
Sure. I'll say one trend that we have been seeing in Brazil for the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years is the provision of bank as a services or even payment as a services. This is a huge trend. So far, the Central Bank of Brazil has not issued specific regulations to govern bank as a service or even payments as a service. So we still have just the general regulation, the financial regulation and payments regulation. But we are seeing a trend, or at least one relevant movement in this regard in the Brazilian instant payments industry. There was a change in the end in the regulation in the end of last year, restricting specific types of service provision or the provision of services in connection with instant payments. And this is something that potentially impacts the bank as a service or payment as a service industry, and could be a first step in a way of the central bank regulating this type of activity. So if you move now to the virtual assets industry, we have a legal framework that was already published and it's official. We have a regulation that is going to be enacted. I'm not sure if the central bank is going to tackle this issue of bank as a service or virtual assets as a service in this regulation. Maybe not, because it's something very specific. But considering the trend that has initiated in the end of last year, in terms of regulating aspects of bank as a service or payment as a service in payments, it may be something that could happen in the future with virtual assets, especially if the virtual assets as a service becomes a relevant trend in the industry here in the following years. But I would say that in the absence of a specific regulation, you would be able to do the services in principle, and of course, we will have to take some. When you talk about bank as a service, for instance, as a parallel, there are of course a number of concerns that you have and measures that you take to mitigate risks, and you should do something similar also if you're doing this with virtual assets. But I'll say that you have, in principle, room to provide the services, at least until the central bank issues specific regulations for that.
Thank you very much.
I think Martin has a question, please.
Thank you, Marcelo. Martin?
Yes, Marcelo, maybe I understood wrong, but you said that institutions or companies cannot invest directly in virtual assets in Brazil. That's correct?
Investment funds.
Investment, sorry?
Investment funds in Brazil cannot do that. Right.
Investment funds. Okay,
yeah, specific investment funds, yeah. But if you are an individual or if you're a legal entity, you are able to invest in virtual assets.
And what about banks?
So far, there are no clear guidelines on whether banks could invest in virtual assets. With the new law states that entities authorized to operate by the Central Bank of Brazil may be able to invest or to operate as digital asset service providers. This is good news because this could clearly enable financial institutions and payment institutions to invest in virtual assets and to provide services in connection with virtual assets. Of course, it remains that the regulations was not enacted yet, so it must be regulated. But I would say that this is a clear indication that there's a trend, at least, that will enable financial institutions to be able to invest in these assets. With the current framework, I would say it's something that involves risks and probably not advisable to do the investment directly. But with this new provision in the law, and especially once the regulation is enacted, I'd say there's probably a better scenario for investments by financial.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin and Marcelo. Is there any other question?
And of course, if there's something that is not clear, like the issue about the investment funds, anyone to ask, please feel free to ask. We covered a lot of issues here. And
Ave tiene 135.000 usuarios activos, Valores activos en realidad, las cuales
I think Inez is with the headphone.
Yeah, I just muted her. Yeah.
So we covered a lot of topics here. So if you have any questions or things that you want to clarify or something that I wasn't clear when I was explaining, please feel free to ask. It's a pleasure. They're here at least until 20 minutes more.
We're gonna this meeting is recorded and we're gonna upload it to the YouTube channel of the Argentina Fintech Chamber. So and of course we're gonna send the link to all of the people that work here in the meeting, plus Marcelo's contact if anyone wants to maybe get in touch and, I don't know, ask anything more specific. The idea of these spaces is to generate some, general knowledge about interesting topics. Definitely crypto in Argentina, as you said, Marcelo, is getting really hot, not only because of the adoptions and the world-class companies we have here, but of course there's a regulatory wave, let's say, probably coming sooner than later, and we are diligently working on it. So this type of experiences from countries of the region, specifically Brazil, which it's always a good example to analyze. We think these are really valuable spaces. So thank you so much. And if there's no other question, we will finish the session. And well, Marcelo, I don't know, Sebastián, if you want to say any closing words, maybe?
Just final remarks. Basically, I think it's, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the webinar, it's quite important to have comparative legislation from Brazil and try to analyze it, because in the past, our regulators, not only the Comisión Nacional de Valores, but also the Argentine Central Bank, had taken a similar approach as Brazilian authorities or other authorities from Latin America. So I think that the CNB officers and Argentine Central Bank officers will take a look on this virtual asset law and complementary and supplementary regulation. So I think that this is something that we have to look carefully, because many of the approach followed by the Brazilian authorities will want to follow up or followed by the CNB and the Argentine Central Bank. So we have to take a look on this new regulation and law. That's basically what I want to say. And at the end, I also it's interesting when Marcelo mentioned that in the case of derivatives that are considered securities, if the derivatives are based on underlying assets that are virtual assets, then they will be considered also securities. So when they mention if a foreign entity can offer crypto assets or virtual assets to Brazilian residents, then Marcelo mentioned that they have to be registered in order to do it. In Argentina, they have a similar approach because derivatives are also considered securities. But in the case of underlying assets as virtual assets, then we have to see whether or not will be considered or not a security now, because the CNB does not have jurisdiction to mention or to include virtual assets as an underlying asset under a derivative. So there are many things that we have to look, and I hope that the Cámara Argentina Fintech and their members will tackle this eventual future regulatory framework to come in the near future, and try to look at the Brazilian regulation legislation.
Thank you, Sebastián. Marcelo, any final words from your side?
Well, I'd like to thank you, Mariano, Sebastián, and everyone for the opportunity. It was a pleasure to discuss this issue with you. I think this was probably the first step here in Brazil in terms of regulation of virtual assets, because we have now the legal framework, but we still lack the regulation itself. So probably going to be many new chapters here in this matter in Brazil, when we'll be able to let you know once there's something relevant happens here, for instance, the appointment of the regulator, if we have a public hearing and to enact the regulation on digital assets and things like that. And if you want to have a follow-up discussion in the future, once these things happens, I'll be available. It'll be a pleasure to meet again and discuss with you.
Thank you, Marcelo. And let me, just before closing, let me tell everybody that the next talk we're going to do is going to be in March. And it's going to be in person. It's going to be a meetup. We're going to have very special guests from UK, and we're going to talk about open banking. So then you're going to receive news. All of the companies that are part of the association will receive news, and it will be a pretty fun and interesting event, of course. So I hope everyone has a good day. Thank you for joining. Well, let's meet the next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.